It's time now to take a look at how we can use two-way data binding so that updates to our model are reflected in our UI and vice versa. For many of the rest of our examples, we're going to be working on an existing website for a fictitious company called H+ Sport, which sells sports drinks, vitamins, and apparel. I've downloaded part of the main template, which you can find in the exercise files under Chapter 1, 0104, the Start folder, H+ Sport. So what we can do is just drag everything inside of this folder into the root folder of our Cloud9 workspace. We're going to be working on the subscribe.html page here. And for now, I want you to completely ignore just about all of the static markup in this file. We're using this template to make our page look a little more professional, and also because we're going to be using the H+ Sport API later on to work with some test data that will fetch using AJAX. So if you just scroll down a little, or if you do Control F and search for the word view, you should come to this section that's sort of set apart from the rest of the markup, which is the only part of this page that we're really concerned with right now. You can see that I've started us off by creating a new view instance that's mounted to the div here with a single property in data called email that's bound to this email field up here with the colon shorthand for vbind. So let's view it in the browser. Pre-populating a form value like we've done here will be useful in some cases, but often what you want to do for form fields is enable two-way binding. You can see in the console that vm.email has the value mike@example.com. If I edit the value here, it's not reflected in my model. So this would be an example of one-way binding. We can achieve two-way binding if, instead of the shorthand for the vbind directive with value, we just use the vmodel directive with the value email. So let's make that change. And instead of relying on the console to test, let's just add a line to display the current value of the email property, which will be now an empty string by default. So we'll just add this paragraph using string interpolation on email to display whatever the current value of email is. So now when I start typing, you can see that Vue is updating the inner text of that paragraph immediately. It's actually responding to the input event, which is raised every time the contents of that field changes, even if we were to paste into it, which you can see here. This behavior won't always be desirable though, but you can easily alter it so that it responds to the change event instead by adding what's known as a modifier to vmodel. In particular, one called lazy. And we do that by adding .lazy after vmodel. So if I refresh here, now you can see that the text isn't updated until after I tab away from that field. Other useful modifiers include trim for trimming extra space from the beginning and end of the input, and number for converting the input string to a number type. Using vmodel with other input elements, or a text area or select, is similar and usually straightforward, but let's see how we might use it with a group of related checkboxes. I'm going to add an additional property here called selected interests, which will be an array instead of a string. That's because it's going to store a collection of values that reflect which of the checkboxes here have been selected by the user. Next, we'll add our vmodel directive. And we're going to use the same vmodel value for each checkbox so that they're all associated with our new data property, selected interests. To do this, I'm going to use a handy feature of Cloud9 called multiple cursors. If I hold down Control and Alt, or Option, and click in these three locations, I can then type v-model equals selected interests for all of them. Notice that I need to leave the value attribute since they all have different values even though they're associated with the same model property. I'm just going to comment out this paragraph element to make this easier to see. And this time, to display the user input, instead of just using the property name in double curly braces, I'm going to use the array method join and join each selected value with a comma and a space. Then refresh the page and start clicking the checkboxes, and you can see that it's pushing each value onto that array as I'm checking these off, and then updating the inner text immediately. If we wanted to have some of these pre-selected when the page loaded, we could just change the default value for selected interests. If I add running and swimming to this array, then you can see that they're automatically checked and displayed when I refresh. You can also update the array programmatically at runtime, of course, although there are some gotchas to be aware of there, which we'll talk about later in the course. So we've now seen that when form field values change, we can make the data properties in our view instance change accordingly. Conversely, we've seen that by changing the initial values of the properties in the data object, or by editing them at runtime, those changes are then reflected in the DOM.